Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Eruvin. We are up to Perek Hey Mishnah Gimel. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilui Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Ranbai ben Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. The previous Mishnah taught that we extend a city's borders by 70 and 2/3 amot in order to connect it to a neighboring city. This next Mishnah, today's Mishnah, applies the same principle to connect three places by using an additional leniency. Again, I recommend following in the Art School Elucidated to see the diagrams that they bring to explain this Mishnah and the next Mishnah. The Mishnah begins, V'chen shelosha chifarim hamshulashin, and so too when there are three villages grouped together like a triangle, so that two of them stand opposite each other with a space between them, and a third stands some distance away opposite that space. Diagram A, whoever can follow along. Im yesh ben shnai mechitzonim 141 ushlish. If the space between the two outer villages is such that if we were to imagine the entire third village being moved into that space, there would be no more than 141 and 1/3 amot left between the middle village and either of the outer villages, which is diagram B in the Art School Elucidated. Asa imtsayet shloshtan liotan keechad. Then the middle village makes the three of them become like one large town for the purposes of measuring their techum, which is diagram C. Now, this is because we consider the three villages as if they were standing in a row, with the borders of each village extended by 70 and 2/3 amot. If there would be no more than 141 and 1/3 amot between one village and the next, then the borders of each village would reach those of its neighbor, and therefore they are all considered one town. Now, the leniency of imagining that the middle village is directly between the outer ones applies only if the true distance between the middle village and each of the outer ones is no more than 2,000 amot. Again, diagram B. Since one could travel between any of the outer villages and the middle one without an eruv techumin, the Rav explains the rabbis were lenient and allowed all the villages to be viewed as if they were standing in a row. And that is the end, Rabotai, of Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Dal now discusses how a techum is actually measured. It begins with the length of the measuring rope. En modedin ela bechevel shel 50 amah. We measure the techum only with the 50 amah rope, measuring 50 amot at a time until we reach 2,000 amot. And the Rav explains the rope was made of linen, which is strong and does not stretch when a 50 amah rope is pulled, taught by two people. Now, the measurers had to pull the rope tight with all their strength. The Mishnah continues, Lo pachot. It may not be less than 50 amot long, because a shorter rope gets stretched and becomes longer than it's supposed to be. So, for example, if a 20 amah rope were used, it would eventually stretch and become slightly larger. The measurers, however, would still count that distance as 20 amot, v'lo yoter, and the Mishnah says it may not be more than 50 amot long, because a longer rope often sags in the middle when it's held by two people. Either way, the measurements will be inaccurate, so it has to be a 50 amah rope. The Mishnah now describes how the measurers hold the rope. V'lo imdod ele cheneged libo. Each may measure only with the rope held against his chest, so that they both hold it at the same height and not at an angle, which the Rav explains. If one measurer would hold the rope near his head and the other near his feet, the rope would be at an angle and the distance measured would actually be less than 50 amot in a straight line. And the Mili explains that the Mishnah assumes that both partners are of the average height, so the rope is not at an angle when the measurers hold it against their chests. And the Mishnah discusses now how to measure ground that has dips and rises. Hayam moded v'giya legai or legader. If he was measuring and he reached a valley or a pile of stones from a collapsed fence, mavli'o, he measures in a way that absorbs the slopes of the valley or fence, meaning he measures in a straight line across the top of them. Now the Rav explains if he would have to measure up and down the sides of the valley or stone pile, the techum would end up closer to the city, and the rabbis were lenient about this and allowed measuring in a straight line across the top of the valley or pile, thereby extending the techum farther. Now, if the width of the uneven ground from one side to the other is 50 amot or less, so that a 50 amah rope reaches across it, he measures directly across the top, which whoever has the Art School Elucidated would be diagram A in Mishnah 4. 4. Now, in the case of a tall pile of stones, the measuring rope has to be raised over the pile. Each end of the measuring rope is tied to a pole, and the measurers use the poles to lift the rope and stretch it over the pile, which would be diagram B. And in this case, we have no choice but to allow measuring with the rope held above chest level. Now, if the width of the uneven ground varies and directly opposite the city it is wider than 50 amot, but off to one side of the city it narrows to 50 amot, then he may move from the place opposite the city where he's measuring and walk in a straight line to the place off to the side of the city where he can use the rope to measure across the top of the uneven ground, and he then continues measuring along that new line. And when he reaches a place in which he can walk back in a straight line to the even ground that is directly opposite the city, he returns to his original line of measurement and continues measuring from there. Again, diagram C in the art school elucidated will help understand what the Mishnah is describing. The Mishnah continues with a similar case. If he reached a mountain while measuring the tchum, he measures in a way that absorbs the sides of the mountain, meaning he measures over the top of it in a straight line, just as with a pile of stones. Now, the Mishnah discusses the case of a mountain separately, only because of the upcoming law of making a hole, which was originally taught with regards to mountains, which the Mishnah says. Again, higia lahar mavlio. If he reached a mountain, he absorbs the sides of the mountain, which we said means he measures over the top of it in a straight line, just as with a pile of stones. The chozer lemidaton. If the hill is such that he has to move and measure from some point that's not opposite the city, he may do so, and he then returns to his original line of measurement. Ubilvad shelo yetzeh chutz hatchum. However, wherever the measurer needs to move to an area that is not opposite the city, he may do so only as long as he does not go out of the tchum of the city for this purpose, which the Rav explains. If the uneven ground that it's not opposite the city narrows to 50 amot only in a place that is so far away that it's out of the city's tchum, the measurers may not go there to measure the tchum. And the Rav explains the rabbis were concerned that people might think that the place where the measurers went is actually within the tchum, and they might walk there on Shabbat. Now the Mishnah teaches what to do if measuring the uneven ground in the way described above is impossible. If the measurer is unable to absorb the slope made by the uneven ground by using a 50 amah rope, so for example, a mountain that narrows to 50 amot only beyond the city's tchum, Bazu Amar Rabbi Dostai Bar Rabbi Yanai Mishum Rabbi Meir. Regarding this case, Rabbi Dostai Bar Rabbi Yanai said in the name of Rabbi Meir, Shamati shemikadirin beharim. I heard from my teachers that we make a hole through mountains, meaning we measure the mountain in a way that imitates drilling a hole through the bottom of one into the other with the long measuring rope running through it. Now, the length of that measurement is the distance that counts towards the tchum, and the slope of the mountain is not counted. Now, the commentators go at length to explain what the Mishnah means here. The actual measurement is done with the rope that is only 4 amot long. One measurer stands at the foot of the mountain and the other stands a little higher up the slope. The one lower down holds the rope to his chest, while the one higher up holds it to his feet. The rope is thereby held in a straight line, and the slope of the mountain is not counted in the measurement of 4 amot. Now the measurer who was on the bottom then climbs somewhat higher up the mountain, and they again measure in the same way, repeating this as many times as necessary until they reach the bottom of the mountain on the other side. Now measuring a straight line of 4 amot repeatedly is the same as taking a long rope and running it through the bottom of the mountain from one side to the other. Whoever can see diagram D in the art school elucidated notes. Now this leniency is made only with regard to measuring the 2000 amot of Techum Shabbat, which is only a rabbinic requirement. However, the Rav says when biblical measurements are required for Arei Miklat, the cities of refuge, and the Eglah Rufa, the decapitated calf, this method may not be used. And the Rav does tell us, Rabbi Dostai, the Halakha does follow the opinion of Rabbi Dostai. That is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.